Hey everyone, and welcome back to our series, Thriving in Babylon, which is a deep dive into the book of Daniel. And just to get you caught back up on maybe what you might have missed over the last few weeks, 2,600 years ago, King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, started taking over the known world. And they would sweep the region and take over cities, and they would do is capture some of the best and the brightest from all of these different regions that they would conquer and take them back into Babylon to brainwash them and to give them a royal education that would allow them to become advisors and helpers to the king himself. And 4 of those young men were by the names of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You might know the last 3 by their more common names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But if you really look at the story of the book of Daniel, you start to learn that Babylon was not a tolerant society. It was not some place that was kind to Judaism. In fact, if you were to look at this from a further distance back, you would say that Judaism should have been stamped out during this time. However, Daniel and his friends were able to thrive living in this godless society, and Judaism was able to survive. And so the question for us today is, how can we thrive in Babylon? What do you do when you're at odds with culture? What do you do when you're the underdog? And so this morning, to kind of get us set up, I want to tell you about a day in my life that really wasn't going too smooth. On March 31st, 2018, I was moving, literal packing boxes, getting the truck put together. Not only that, it was the day before Easter. And as a pastor, Easter is like your Super Bowl. That's already a pretty stressful day. Did I also mention that I had a 7-month-old daughter that was crawling and needing constant attention? 2 weeks before, we just found out that my wife was pregnant with our second born. We had just gotten back on Tuesday from a cross-country trip to go to my sister's wedding. And oh yeah, I was sick. I needed to go to the doctor, needed to get to urgent care as fast as possible. It was one of those days. And as soon as I thought I was in the clear, we was getting ready to hand over the keys to the new owners. We were disconnecting the washer, and the cold water line to the washing machine breaks, and water starts flooding onto the floor. And I was left asking myself this question, and really having this mantra just go through my head over and over and over. If something else goes wrong, man, so help me. And the thing is, I know that you've lived through that life before too. You've lived through that day. You sleep, you have a really bad night of sleep, and you wake up really late, and you get to work, and you're just off your game, and all of a sudden you get a phone call, and your kid is sick and needs to get picked up. You get reamed out by your boss, and you just find yourself asking the question, man, if something else goes wrong, what am I going to do? So help me, right? Or maybe you have a flat tire and you have to pay to get it towed to a mechanic, and they replace the tire, but then 2 days later, something else goes wrong in the car, and you're left asking, man, if something else goes wrong, man, so help me. I think a lot about the St. Louis Rams, who became the Los Angeles Rams in 2016, where their owner, Stan Kroenke, said, now we're in our new city, Los Angeles, we need to build a stadium. So what does he do? He finds a plot of land, and he says, I'm going to build the most incredible stadium. And the estimates for it were astronomical, $2.5 billion. Then they start working on it, and they find out pretty quickly that it wasn't going to be built for $2.5 billion. It was going to be much, much more, $5 billion. But that's okay, because it's going to become the premier large event gathering space in the nation. Slated to open July 2020, right in the middle of a global pandemic where no large events are going to happen. I kind of wonder if they're down there at the Los Angeles Rams headquarters and asking, man, if something else goes wrong, so help me. My question for you is, what is your response to stress? Let me take it a step further. What is your response to stress in the midst of chaos? Where nothing is under your control, everything is going wrong, and you just find yourself saying, if something else happens, so help me. Now, I have a lot of chaos in my life. I am the dad of a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old, and they're constantly bouncing off the walls. But one way that I've learned that I can wrangle them under control is by handing them a coloring sheet and a crayon. For some reason, just calms them down immediately. And I got to tell you something. I love their style for how they color, because what they do is they take their one crayon and they just start scribbling. They don't care about the lines. They don't care about what the picture is underneath. They just start going to town. And the thing is, I have to think that for many of us, the way that my toddlers color a coloring sheet is the same way a lot of us respond to when stress and chaos start to ensue in our life. In fact, what happens to some people, what happens when stress and chaos start happening, they start just like scribbling with the crayon of escapism. They find themselves falling down into a pattern of just binging TV or escaping to alcohol or sex or something that is a lot like comfort food, where you indulge now and you think about the consequences later. I mean, some people, they start scribbling with the crayon of control, where they're thinking, I can't necessarily control my circumstances, but I can control the people and maybe the things around me that I can. And they just start scribbling away, and everything in their world is colored with that one crayon. You can't see what's underneath because the crayon color has dominated everything. Other people, it's like anger takes over, and their response to stress and chaos is they just start scribbling all over the place, and they only see one thing, or maybe it's self-sabotage. And one thing that I have to kind of ask myself is, what am I going to do now that stress and chaos is just at the forefront of my everyday? See, what are we going to do now that it seems like some of our phases are being rolled back, where the restrictions are put back in place, where there might be some more uncertainty to your job or some uncertainty to how you go and have fun? What is your response going to be now that things seem to be going backwards rather than forwards? You know, the first 2 to 3 weeks of the pandemic, it manifested itself, the stress and the chaos manifested itself in the form of anxiety. And then what it did is it seemed to transition out of anxiety into depression. And then over time, it's like the depression gave way to where now we just have this subterranean anger building up inside of us, where like any little thing might set us off. And you've noticed this, I've noticed this with myself, that our response to stress and chaos, it colors everything around us. We respond differently, we talk to people differently, we act differently. Today, in our study through the book of Daniel, I want to compare and contrast two men and their drastically different responses to stress and chaos in their lives. Daniel 2:1 says this: "One night during the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had such disturbing dreams that he couldn't sleep." Now, the first time you read this through, it might not seem like it's that big of a deal, right? Because, I mean, we've all had like weird and disturbing dreams. And I think back to a Nova special that I watched several years ago, where one of the scientists, his theories about what dreams are all about is it's like a survival technique that we all have, where it's like your brain testing you in different circumstances and situations. And, you know, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, it'd be like, what are you going to do if a wolf walks into your village? But for us, in like 21st century comfort, our dreams are a little bit funnier. Almost like, you know, you might have a dream where you're back in high school, and it's like your brain is saying, like, Matt, what would you do if you had to go back to high school? But this time, you had a hairy back. It's like, come on, brain, like, why would I even need to know this, right? Like, what would that help me in anything? But I think you've been there, where you've had a weird dream, where you wake up and it sours the rest of your day. Like, it colors everything that you see. And what happens is you have one of those dreams where it's so disturbing that like you can't go back to sleep. And what do you do if you try and go back to sleep and that dream starts playing over and over and over? This is the type of dream that Nebuchadnezzar is having. Like, it's one that has just completely derailed his life. And at this point, he's one of the most powerful men in the world, and quite possibly, to this point, he was the most powerful man ever in the history of the world. And he's so disturbed by this that he's like, I need to call my advisors together. So it actually says he calls his magicians, his enchanters, his sorcerers, and his astrologers. And he's like, bros, like, what is happening when I go to sleep? And at first, this might seem like, this is your friend who's just a little too into Harry Potter, like calling all the sorcerers and the astrologers together. But from what we know about Babylonian history, these are some of the most trusted people in the king's entourage. It'd be a lot like the cabinet to POTUS. Like, it's the people that he trusts the most. And so he goes to them and he says, guys, I need you to interpret my dream. And they look at him and they say, well, why don't you tell us what your dream is, and then we can give you an answer. And apparently, Nebuchadnezzar is so disturbed and so bothered by his dream that he says, I don't want to leave this up to chance that you guys are just going to tell me what I want to hear. I need you to tell me first what I dreamt, and then the answer, the meaning behind this. And they start pushing back and they say, no, just tell us what your dream was. And he says, no, I'm holding the line. I am not going to be placated. And this is their response in verse 11. It says, the king's demand is impossible. No one except the gods can tell you your dream, and they do not live here among people. Okay, quick time out. This is in literary circles what we would call foreshadowing. I don't want to ruin the rest of the Bible if you've never read it, but what we believe is God actually did decide to go and live among the people. But we'll talk about that more later. Verse 12 says this, the king was furious when he heard this, and he ordered that all the wise men of Babylon, all the astrologers, all the sorcerers, all the magicians, all the people he trusts the most, all the wise men of Babylon be executed. And because of the king's decree, men were sent to find and kill Daniel and his friends. This is Nebuchadnezzar's response. You're all going to die, whether you were in the room or not. And just think about this for a second. The people who understood a very complex military, civil, and political machine are all being sentenced to death because the king had a bad dream. I want to give you some life advice that might just change the rest of your life. It's this. Don't make life-altering decisions when you're in an emotionally heightened state. Just don't do it. Don't make a life-altering decision when you're in an emotionally heightened state. The Bible talks a lot about this concept of being sober-minded, and what we learn is that your mind, the way that you think, can be intoxicated by more than just alcohol. There's a lot of different factors that can change the way that you make decisions. In fact, what happens is a lot of you start walking through stress and chaos, and what you find happening is you start acting different, you start thinking different, you start doing things that would normally be contrary to your own character. So you start going through chaos, and suddenly you start burning relational bridges. You start going through stress, and you are fantasizing about quitting your job. You start flirting with that guy at the gym. You start plotting a move across the world. You start finding yourself just dreaming about acting it out on these strong emotions. And see, we all know this, but we need to be reminded about it, is that acting out on strong emotions like that before you're able to step back and think soberly, it's a lot like scratching a bug bite. It feels really good in the moment, but ultimately it's not good for us. I mean, there's a lot of movies and things in our pop culture that celebrate just acting out on our strong emotions. I think about the movie Jerry Maguire, where he's getting fired after writing that big manifesto, and he walks out in the office and he does that whole thing of like, hey everyone, I know you're expecting me to freak out, and he does that like, who's coming with me? And the funny thing is, like in the movie, it kind of works, and like his life seems to pan out great. And the thing is, that's fantasy. Like that doesn't work in the real world. Like let me just give you some of the best advice that you're ever going to get. Like if you're contemplating just like quitting your job in the midst of stress and chaos, if you're contemplating leaving your wife in the midst of stress and chaos, if you're at such an emotionally heightened state that like 6 months from now, you don't think you would make the same decision, here's my advice to you. Don't do it. My daughters, they like to watch this show on PBS called Daniel Tiger, and one of the songs that they sing is, if you feel so mad that you want to roar, take a deep breath and count to 4. And I'm like, okay, toddler song, you get this, right? Like, We even understand, even at an early age, that when we allow our emotions to take over, when we allow those strong feelings to start guiding our decision making, we don't always make the best decision. There's already a ton of problems with the expression, follow your heart, but I'm going to try and just boil it down to have it make a little bit more sense, okay? Here's some life advice for you. Don't follow your heart if it has an irregular beat, okay? Like if you're not thinking the way that you normally do, if you're the type of person that normally wouldn't make this decision, hold off. Make decisions after the crisis, not in the middle of it. Okay, you might be picking up on the fact that we're only in chapter 2 of Daniel, and already the title character's life is in jeopardy. And I gotta tell you, Daniel, he handles it completely different. And he's truly living in the midst of chaos. We're not talking about a bad dream that he's had. I mean, his life is in danger. There's people who are being sent to his home to kill him. And he's really, for all intents and purposes, completely powerless in the situation. But this is how we get him handling this in Daniel 2:14. It says, when Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, came to kill them, Daniel handled the situation with wisdom and discretion. He asked Arioch, why has the king issued such a harsh decree? So Arioch told him all that had happened. Here is the goal. We want to handle stress and chaos with wisdom and discretion. So this is what he did. Daniel went at once to see the king, and he requested more time to tell the king what the dream had meant. If you ever want to know how to handle stress with wisdom and discretion, Daniel went at once. You want to run to your problems, not away from them. Don't run from your problems, run to your problems. You know, a few years back, Pastor Brian actually told me a story about the difference between cows and buffaloes on the open plains. I begged the team to animate this for me, but they said no. So the best I could do was some clip art on some sticks. So I hope this makes sense. But when you have a storm that starts moving into the open plains, you have cows, they'll look over their shoulders and they start running away from the storm. And so what happens is the storm eventually catches up to them, but now they're running alongside of it. And so at the end of the day, the cows, they spend way longer in the middle of the storm and they get far wetter. Now buffaloes, on the other hand, when they see a storm coming, they don't run away from the problem, they run to the problem. So they start moving to it, and what they find happening is they get through the problem, they get through the storm so much faster, not because they're avoiding it, but because they're running to it. And I think that we've all lived enough to understand just how this plays out in your own life. You have a problem, and you try and avoid it, and you wait it out, and your fight or flight kicks in, and you decide to fly away from it, and you find yourself a week later, 2 weeks later, your stress has not come down. In fact, usually it amplifies because you're not willing to deal with it. However, in those rare moments where you run to your problems, you go to the person and say, hey, tell me more about this, or help me understand what's going on. It might be more painful up front, but you get through it so much faster. The difference between cows and buffaloes. Cows run away from their problems. Buffaloes run to their problems. Daniel went at once. But that's not where he stops either. If you want to handle stress with wisdom and discretion, it says this in verse 17. Then Daniel went home and told his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, what had happened. He urged them to ask the God of heaven to show them his mercy by telling them the secret, so they would not be executed along with the other wise men of Babylon. And that night, the secret was revealed. Guys, if you want to handle stress and chaos with wisdom and discretion, prayer is your first step. You know, the statement, all we can do now is pray, Honestly, that's pretty telling, isn't it? It's like, let's exhaust all of our resources, let's try everything that we can, and if there's nothing else, then hey, we'll throw it to God right now. What if I told you the answer to all of your problems just wants to be asked? He just wants you to bring it to him. He just needs to be asked. And the thing is, there's a lot that happens with prayer. Prayer releases anxiety, it gives confidence, it gives you peace of mind, helps you understand God's will. In fact, I love 19th century pastor Charles Spurgeon, what he said about prayer. He says, prayer is the slender nerve that moves the muscle of omnipotence. The answer to all of your problems is willing to be asked. Daniel immediately goes to God with this problem, not away from it. And I also want to point out, too, as you really read through what's happening here in this passage, Daniel's motivation for praying, it might be different than what you would expect or suspect. See, a lot of times when we read through the Bible, the characters in it, they just seem so unrelatable to us because we don't really look at them as like human beings. We look at them like they're these better than people than ourselves. And so what we do is we think like, man, Daniel's motivation that day is he probably just wanted to like give glory to God, and he probably wanted to like put a stake in the ground for his faith. But when you really read through why he went to pray, it's because he didn't want to be executed. And the reason I want to point this out is I think that sometimes we avoid prayer because we don't really feel like our motivation is 100% noble. And the thing is, I want to challenge you. Go to God in prayer no matter what your motivation is. You might find that sometimes as you bring your problems, you bring your needs to him, that he might not change your circumstance, but he might change your mind. The other thing I'd like to point out here is it actually says that God actually reveals the secret to Daniel and his friends about what the dream actually meant. So just think about this for a second. Nebuchadnezzar's dream actually had meaning, which means that God gave that dream to Nebuchadnezzar, which means that dream put him on edge, which made him have sleepless nights, which made him bring in his advisors and made him question them, which then in turn made him threaten them, which then set Daniel up for the opportunity that would forever differentiate him in the eyes of the king. Think about this for a second. The source of your greatest stress, it might be the catalyst for your greatest opportunity. Daniel was so cool under pressure. I mean, here he has a guy come into his house to kill him, to end his life. And he seems to just take it in stride. Like he seems to handle it so much better than how I would handle it if I was in the same situation. And one of the things I have to just believe as I read through this, it's only chaos if you're unsure of the future. Daniel had been building his faith muscles for years. I mean, he was ripped from his home at an early age, away from his family. He was sent to a royal academy to be brainwashed. We actually have reason to believe that Daniel and his friends were also castrated and made into eunuchs so that there was no fear of them trying to take over the kingdom. And they just seemed to handle it so much better. And one of the reasons why, he'd been going through things and troubles and trials and temptations for years, building those faith muscles. Now, you might be wondering, like, what was Nebuchadnezzar's dream actually all about? Well, I just want to tell you, it's actually very consequential to world history and like political epochs throughout the millennia, but it's probably not that consequential to your tomorrow. Because what are you going to do now that you're entering month 4 of being locked down, maybe unemployed or underemployed? What crayon are you reaching for? What are you trying to do to alleviate your stress and your chaos? I want to challenge you to be like Daniel, to handle your stress and your chaos with wisdom and discretion. to not run from your problems, but run to your problems. Take it to God in prayer and believe that He ultimately has a plan in place. 600 years after this, one of the early church leaders, a man by the name of Paul, would pen these words in Romans chapter 5. He says, "We can rejoice when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance, and endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. And this hope will not lead to disappointment." One of the reasons, one of the ways that Daniel was able to stay cool and to handle this with wisdom and discretion is that when problems hit, he didn't reach for the other crayon. He didn't start trying to scribble and cover up everything. He allowed God to paint a picture of beauty in his life, that he saw it as an opportunity for God to develop endurance, and for that endurance to develop character, and for that character to develop hope. I want to challenge you as we continue walking through a very uncertain time. Resist the urge to get bitter. I want to challenge you. Use this as an opportunity to change your perspective. See this as an opportunity to rejoice, develop endurance, develop character, develop hope. Reserve the urge to scribble away your problems with escapism, control, anger, self-sabotage. See, what you start to learn over time is that more often than not, it's not your circumstances that bring you chaos. It's your response to your circumstances that brings chaos into your life. Jesus, on his final night, is in the Garden of Gethsemane before he's about to be betrayed and led to the cross, and he actually gives a prayer to God saying, "If it could be your will, I'm asking that you would take this cup from me." He was going through an incredibly stressful and chaotic episode. And what if Jesus, rather than handling this with wisdom and discretion, had decided to reach for the crayon and scribble away his problems? I want to challenge you. Allow God to color in the lines. Allow yourself to see the beautiful picture that God is painting. But let's talk about the first step. The first step to experiencing this type of endurance, character, and hope is know that God actually did come down and live among us. That Jesus himself stepped out of the throne room of heaven and lived among us. He experienced the stress that we experience. He experienced the chaos that we experience. And then he went to the cross, and he sacrificed himself, went into the grave, and came back victorious over Satan, sin, and death. And he's offering to give your stress and chaos purpose. He's offering to give your life meaning. He's offering to not waste a moment, to give you the ability to actually rejoice when things don't go your way. And I want to challenge you. If you've never taken that first step of asking Jesus to forgive you of your sins and take full control of your life, that today would be that day. In fact, I would love to pray with you right now. God, I want to pray for those who are watching today online. Or maybe they're listening to this on a podcast, maybe a day later, a month later, 2 years later. The God, that you would put this prayer on their lips and in their heart, that God, I can't do this on my own. I need you. I'm asking you to forgive me of my sins and take full control of my life. God, I'm asking you to become the boss, the coach, and the CEO, my Lord and my Savior. God, I also want to pray for those who are listening today who are walking through chaos and stress, and they find themselves just scribbling away the picture and the painting that you're trying to develop inside their life. The God, that you would give them peace of mind, that you would give them a sober mind, the God, that they would be able to handle stress and chaos with wisdom and discretion. The God, you would give them the ability and the strength to fight off the urge to make a rash decision in the middle of their chaos. And God, that you would be able to redeem this moment forever. I pray this in your name. Amen.